From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs, and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
And hello again. Welcome to another edition of Chicago Newsroom right here on Can TV. I'm Ken Davis, and today we're going to talk about politics, as we always do on Chicago Newsroom. But today it's the politics of culture in Chicago, because everything in Chicago is political, and culture is really political, except that it doesn't get covered the same way on the front pages. So we're going to talk about some of that today. Joining us today, Alison Cuddy from WBEZ. I'm so happy to have you here for the first time. Thanks for joining us, Alison. Nick Rabkin is also joining us today. Nick is from, well, ostensibly from Columbia College, but we're having you on today for your other connections, because you're working on assessments of culture for the city of Chicago and lots of other things, which will all reveal themselves and become clear as time goes by.
Perhaps.
As clear as one can get when one is talking about culture. I was thinking that it would be interesting to just start off and say, what is culture? And see if maybe you guys can answer that, because that would be kind of fun to do, and maybe we'll get to that on the show today too. But I think it might be interesting to start with the fulfillment of the effort to blend the Department of Cultural Affairs and the Department of Special Events, which in my way of thinking is kind of like trying to blend the fire department with, I don't know, the planning department or something. I mean, they're two departments that are kind of in the, they're all city departments, but they have very, very different missions. Their origins are very different. Their cultures, if you'll excuse the term, are different. But now we see it. It's happened. We have a commissioner. It's been almost a year. Is it working, Alison?
That's a good question. I will take up your first point, what is culture,
yeah.
and answer that through the prism of the city of Chicago, because culture via the city of Chicago, via the former Department of Cultural Affairs, now Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, has been incredible, a significant part of what we understand Chicago to be, whether we're tourists here or residents here. And they have, I think, have been a role model for other, at least North American cities, in terms of the quantity and quality of free programming they do, music, visual arts, all kinds of, the work they do to help neighborhood festivals get underway. So culture in Chicago through the city has been a vibrant, wonderful thing, as we all know.
But that too is somewhat political, because if you look at just sort of behind the scenes, you know that for the last 20 years or so, or certainly all through the Daley administration, it was pretty much led by Lois Weisberg, who was a political figure of power that is almost unprecedented in so many ways. I mean, she was a sort of a ward committeeman, an alderman, a department. She was all those things rolled into one little ball.
She had the ear of the mayor.
And she was a friend of the mayor and of the First Lady, which was really important in Maggie Daley. So she had the power to pretty much just say, let's have a big dance festival. And there would be a big dance festival.
Cows on parade.
Cows on parade. I mean, we could go on. We could spend the rest of the half hour just listing the things she did. But somehow or other, that ran out of gas toward the end of the dying days of her administration and Daley's administration.
Right. You talked about the merger at the end of 2010. Then Mayor Daley made the decision to essentially, what some people said, is gut the Department of Cultural Affairs, headed up by then Commissioner Lois Weisberg, move most, not all of that staff to this nonprofit wing, the Chicago Office of Tourism and Culture, and then Lois Weisberg, and then merged the Office of Special Events with the Department of Cultural Affairs, and Lois Weisberg was to oversee these offices. She decided to step down. I mean, that may have happened anyway. Under a new administration, she was in her 80s, she'd been there for a long time, she had certainly made her mark through that department and as part of the city administration. And so that is a fascinating kind of development here in terms of now we are dealing with the aftermath of that. We have the new commissioner, Michelle Boone. That staff that was moved over to the Office of Tourism and Culture was then laid off at the end of 2011. So most of those staff are gone. Apparently more of those staff will be gone by the end of June. There are more layoffs to come. And now there's this department, as you say, merged, that have some overlap in terms of mission, some very significant differences. And the new commissioner is trying to bring this all together.
Nick, you were a deputy commissioner in
That's right.
in the Department of Special Events.
No, I was in the Cultural Affairs Department.
I'm sorry, you were in Culture. Oh my God, I really do know that. I'm sorry. Yes,
He is a culture vulture.
he is a culture vulture. Right. So you've seen this from the inside and the outside because you were in the funding community for a while. You're one of these guys who's kind of done a little bit of everything.
Yeah, I've had a checkered career. Yes.
Well, I wouldn't say checkered. I would say distinguished. But you've seen it from all different angles. What happened here? This almost looks like some kind of train wreck that happened at the end of the Daley administration.
You know, I've puzzled over it quite a bit, Ken, and I have to candidly admit I don't understand it. Not that I don't understand the logic behind the merger in the following sense. As Alison said, both agencies are committed to cultivating, developing, and sustaining the cultural life of the city, which is vast and complicated, many-layered, and they did have different functions within that big ecosystem of culture, but they were both key players in that ecosystem. So there was a kind of overarching logic to saying, well, if the city's going to downsize in some ways, this might make some sense. I think what precipitated Lois's resignation largely was that the mayor made the decision unilaterally. He didn't consult her. She was opposed to the idea. She didn't like the idea.
One would guess, yeah.
And she resigned in really quite a peak. You know, it's interesting. Here's a sidelight. It was a very similar situation unfolded when Joan Harris was the Commissioner of Cultural Affairs, and the mayor did something that offended Joan. And in her case, she didn't resign. In a peak, she said something publicly critical about the mayor, and she was fired. So these things happen in the Daley City Hall, right? But so I think that there was some logic to it, but. From the outside, at least, the appearances were that it wasn't well orchestrated and planned.
Certainly from the outside. I don't know about the inside, but from the outside it looked that way.
And the inside reports were it wasn't well orchestrated or planned.
There was synergy there.
We don't need to dwell on this for the whole half hour, but we do have things to move on to. But I mean, how would you deal with the perception? Certainly, it's mine, and I think a lot of others that these were not. This was not a marriage of co-equal partners, although Cultural Affairs had massive sort of intellectual power in the city. The power was always in special events. That's where the money is. They do Taste of Chicago. They do the big money festivals. They do the bouncies out in the neighborhoods where the aldermen are, right?
So they do have someone programming that falls under their programming, right, the jumping jacks.
So that's where the politics are, and the Cultural Affairs always struck me as being this kind of fragile little egg that was kind of like bouncing on the waves, and maybe I'm exaggerating somewhat.
It had that fragile egg had a very powerful mother hen.
Oh, that's what we were just saying. Of course, that's absolutely true. But how do you get away from the notion that in this marriage, Cultural Affairs was just pretty much just gobbled up and becomes a sort of a division within this big organization?
Well, I mean, Nick, you could speak to this.
I actually can't.
Here are some thoughts about how you deal with that. One, you appoint a commissioner like Michelle Boone, who has an incredible reputation among the community of arts and artists in Chicago. You know, she was a senior programmer of culture at the Joyce Foundation. Yeah. She was director of Gallery 37.
She also ran, Gallery 37, yeah.
Yeah, an initiative.
So she was obviously handpicked by Maggie Daley, because nobody at Gallery 37 wasn't handpicked by her.
Maggie Daley. So she has a level of credibility. I mean, she seems to me a down-to-earth, pragmatic person. And then you kind of set out what your goals are. But I mean, this is what's fascinating to me, is that this department, as sort of disorganized as it is, as much as it's involved in this regrouping, is undertaking a number of incredibly significant, complicated projects in short order. One is coming up with a new cultural plan for Chicago, Nick Rabkin knows this process well. The last time it was done was what, in 1986, and you were a part of that.
1986, yeah, when I was the deputy commissioner.
Yeah. So you have that process underway. It began in mid-February in terms of having a series of 4 kind of large town hall style meetings in different parts of the city, in the Loop, South, West, North sides. Then over the last month or so, they've held, what, 30?
20. You know, honestly,
a lot.
I don't
Somewhere,
remember.
a
lot.
number. I was
Yeah.
calling it like the city's own or the cultural version of March Madness. You know, they were all over the city, convening, you know, neighborhood people. And you know, the idea here is to kind of assess what's out there. What do we have culturally? What don't we have? I mean, it seems like we understand what the mission of the department is on paper is to get culture out into the neighborhoods. And figure out what role they can play in doing so. So they're embarking on this incredibly ambitious plan. They hope to have their State of Culture report by May next month, and then a list of recommendations by the fall. That's the proposal. But Nick has been very involved.
And how does this compare to the one that you undertook for Harold Washington?
The planning process in the Washington years was much longer. We spent close to 2 years, and we had many more neighborhood meetings. Actually, we had something going on 300 meetings across the city.
Wow.
It was incredibly intensive and
exhausting, I would imagine.
It was. I'm exhausted already, and this is a much meaner process.
Yeah.
The process is telescoped this time for a couple of reasons. One, of course, is because we felt that it could be telescoped. We've now got the internet as a tool for people anywhere. People who might not ever go to a community.
Well, and there's also this thing going on, the cultural survey, right, which is internet based, as I understand.
There was a survey last year, the Creative Chicago Survey. Yeah, and so this Creative Chicago Survey is part of the data, one of the data sets that we're looking at as we develop the State of Culture report. So we're doing all these community meetings. We're also having a series. We're having the last 2 today of 10. What we call sector focus groups, in-depth conversations with leaders in different dimensions of the arts and culture in Chicago. And I'll just mention a couple.
Yeah, I mean, give us some examples. So far, I must say, the conversation sounds very bureaucratic. I mean, it sounds like we're talking about city planning department or something.
Well, it is planning.
I mean, I didn't mean that way. I mean, just say it sounds like you know, like a city department doing its planning sessions. Talk to me about who and what are we talking about? Why are we doing this?
The neighborhood meetings and the town halls were really opportunities for the breadth of the Chicago citizenry to just speak their piece. What does culture mean to you? What makes it important to you? What do you value about the cultural life you have here in Chicago? What do you feel is missing? What do you yearn for? What are your aspirations? So we heard from a lot of people. The town hall meetings had as many as 400 people at them.
No kidding.
The neighborhood meetings have been as small as 9 and as large as 250. Incredibly diverse meetings. And sometimes lots of artists are represented. Lots of arts organizations send people to, but lots of folks, you know, parents whose kids are going to school and who are either happy or unhappy that their school doesn't have arts education.
Programming, yeah.
So we heard all that. Now we're doing these sector focus groups where we're bringing in leadership from different sectors, and we kind of redefine the sectors. Our first impulse, of course, the natural impulse, the default setting would be, well, let's bring in all the theater leadership and talk to them about the future of theater in Chicago. What do they need? What do they want? What do they hope for? But instead of breaking it down by discipline, we started thinking about it from the other end. We started thinking about it at the user end, at the citizenry end. So we did a focus group the other night of just young people, kids, teenagers, who were active in the arts in one way or another, and we talked to them about what the arts mean to them, and why their programs are valuable, and what either brought them to their program, or what keeps their friends from getting involved in the arts. A fascinating conversation. I have to tell you, that reminded me why I love the arts, because those kids were so on fire. They were kids from the Albany Park Theater Project, from Street Level Youth Media, from Jazz Links of the Jazz Institute, a wonderful young piano player, and Marwin, the Visual Arts Organization, and Young Chicago Authors, a couple of kids who'd been on those. Yes.
No, I'm sorry. I was just going to interrupt Alison before she even started talking.
Please do.
No,
I love
please.
that. No, I was just going to say that, you know, I was at some of the initial meetings and would concur with Nick that there's a diversity, there's an incredible diversity of people at the meetings, you know, in terms of age, in terms of where they come from in the city, ethnicity, what their stakes are in this. And there's no shortage of ideas, energy, enthusiasm, you know, sort of a sense of this is what a democratic process looks like and we want to be involved. So change within that realm looks great to people. Then you have this whole realm of, I would say, the media, of which I'm a part, and pundits who are looking at this change and have a very deeply skeptical view of what's going on, that there isn't enough transparency, that why have we hired a consultant to come in?
There's been a lot of criticism of that, right?
Lord Cultural Resources, this Toronto-based.
So the DK's Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events says, okay, we're going to do this big process. We're going to need to hire a consultant to help us do this, which I understand, Nick, you actually work for the consultant.
I'm a subcontractor.
A subcontractor.
To them.
You know, and they are a company, they have a global reputation. They've written cultural plans from cities as small as Thunder Bay, it's this tiny little town in northern Ontario, to I think they're working in the Arab Emirates, or
They are.
Yeah, and they wrote fairly recently Toronto's cultural plan, a plan that I've looked at, and it's actually an incredibly interesting, detailed plan. It doesn't sound all that different from the kinds of issues and concerns and ambitions we have here, which is to make, you know, to disseminate art in an equitable way across the city, to secure the city's reputation as a kind of cultural, you know, a world-class city, but one that's world-class through its cultural economy, you know, that has a lot of the same concerns. How do you create affordable spaces for artists or for organizations? How do you get arts education into the schools? They have a different set of issues than we have. We actually spend more per capita on culture than Toronto does.
We do.
We do.
I would have guessed otherwise, but yeah.
Their mayor has yet to play a significant role, and they have a new mayor in that city, so that's something that they were trying to do. But what I found fascinating about that, and something to think about in terms of Chicago, is they see the role of the city as kind of underwriting, sparking new cultural initiatives, like low-level artists or arts organizations, whether giving them small grants, which the Cultural Affairs Department does. I think they give over $1 million in cultural grants, or they have in the past, to small organizations, nonprofit organizations. But to spark these things that maybe fly below the radar of larger foundations or private interests, you know, who maybe are more interested in funding a significant established artistic enterprise. So the city is kind of a Kickstarter for new artistic ventures and helping those grow, nurturing them, and then maybe you bring in these other actors.
And you think that's a legitimate role for the city to play, to be a Kickstarter?
I think it's an interesting way to think about what the city does. I think that in Chicago we do more than that, absolutely. And there may be new efforts to think about relationships between, you know, I mean, the city already works with all kinds of private companies, corporate interests, who, you know, they generate money through that, through helping to put on programming, through advertising, things like that.
You know, I have to tell you that in one of my previous lives, I did work for the city, just like you, Nick, and I worked in municipal television. And one of the things that we did that turned out to be, I would say, hands down, the most delightful thing I ever did while I was working for the city was we spent a lot of time with Maggie Daly, actually going around doing videos of the kids in after-school matters in the high schools and stuff. Now, I know that program had its detractors, and it was controversial in a lot of political ways because, as we said, it's Chicago, everything's political, but I had such a great time going around to high schools, and these, in many cases, let's just say high schools that are pretty forlorn and bereft of much optimism, and then you go out into the theater and here's like 12 kids sitting there doing Shakespeare or something, or sculpting things. And it was phenomenal to see the energy that some of these kids had for the arts. And you know, the schools don't necessarily celebrate the arts themselves, but here were these kids in the schools doing it.
It's worth pointing out that at every one of the town hall meetings and the neighborhood meetings, arts education was very high on the agenda. In Gage Park the other night, where there were 3 breakout groups, all 3, and they had to choose a theme. Each breakout group had to choose a theme to discuss. All of the breakout groups chose arts education.
Arts education, yeah.
So that's a high priority.
So I hope that message will get back somehow, but you know, who knows? Let me ask the larger question.
There's that journalist skepticism.
That's my job.
Yeah.
I've always been skeptical. This larger question, you know, we're in hard times. You know, there's not a lot of money and all this, and these are always the things. It's like we shouldn't be exploring space. We shouldn't be wasting money on the arts. And City of Chicago has, you know, had a $600 million gap in the budget. We can't afford throwing $1 million here and $1 million there on all these ridiculous poets and musicians and stuff like that. It's just not important to the city. I know I'm asking the wrong people this, but maybe you could make the case.
Well, I hope I can make the case.
Because
I've been trying to do this for a long time.
You made the case in the late 80s, or the mid 80s.
We did,
and I must say, successfully.
I have to say that the town hall meetings and the neighborhood meetings make the case too. It is
you think the people
clear.
of Chicago actually do believe that this is what money well spent?
Ken, there is no the people of Chicago.
Yeah.
There are 3 million
People
of us, and there are 3 million opinions on
Probably
what
4
culture
million
is and what value it has in their lives.
Right.
But I actually do think that, for the most part, people do value culture in one way or another. There are people who sing in church choirs who wouldn't dream of going to the symphony.
Yeah.
There are people who read poetry at the local library who wouldn't dream of going to Chicago Shakespeare Company, right? People engage in culture.
Let me ask the question a little bit different way. The massive stuff like Taste of Chicago, you know, formerly 10 days of eating turkey drumsticks and watching fireworks, and they used to be self-sustaining. The last couple of years they weren't so, but lots and lots of money. But my feeling about it always was, I've always been a big defender of Taste of Chicago, because I go down there pretty much every year. I always like to just stop in just to walk through it, and you'll see hundreds of thousands of people with their kids walking around doing stuff that is, except for the eating part, largely free. And it's kind of like a state fair or a county fair writ large in the city of Chicago. And I always think, whatever it's costing us in police overtime or whatever it is, it's worth it, because this is something that a family can do pretty much for free on a Sunday afternoon. I think that's an important role of government.
I think, you know, one thing we have not talked about in terms of what the department is doing, which is reorganizing, undertaking the cultural plan, but also having to continue with all the programming. And there's been some questions, you know, some things have been canceled, the music series, Music Without Borders. But there's also sort of, you know, people are concerned about what's happening within the cultural center itself. That sort of
absolutely
things
right.
have disappeared.
Right,
the cafe, you know, the kind of like quasi-library that was set up there through the Chicago Publishing Initiative. I mean, I have questions about what's going to happen to Project Onward, something I feel is a significant part of what happens to the cultural department. You know, this area where artists with mental or developmental disabilities create art in its soul, and I think it's like a wonderful initiative. But in terms of sort of thinking, you're right, we are facing interesting political and economic times, and culture is facing that pressure as well. And so, you know, questions about what our priorities should be, how much do we invest in something like Taste of Chicago, or even for that matter, neighborhood festivals. I mean, we have so many music festivals in this city. We have so many neighborhood festivals throughout the city. Do we need them all? Can we sustain them all? Do we have to reorganize things so that some small festivals are going to be paying for electricity or parking or something like that? Does that then sort of is it change the framework, and so you start trying to decide what the priorities really are and what programming is serving the most people the most effectively.
And that's really why it's important to plan from time to time.
Yeah.
Because you have to look at those questions with a little bit of dispassionate, from a dispassionate position.
And times change, attitudes change, technology changes, everything. I mean, one thing that is on the table now is the sort of the private sector involvement. I mean, some of the biggest stuff that happens in Chicago culturally now, in terms of the big stuff, is Pitchfork and Lollapalooza, which are 100% commercial. They use Park District facilities, often without paying much for them, and so they're using this public asset, but it is for a commercial purpose for a corporation to make money to provide entertainment, but it's not free to the user. So
true enough.
Where does that fit in?
There are all kinds of kind of ethical and political and questions about that. Using the park, privatizing in effect Grant Park for a significant portion of the summer. On the other hand, it is an appropriate government function to stimulate business, to build the Chicago brand across the country and internationally, to make Chicago a destination for tourism. We do all kinds of, the city has all kinds of economic development programs, and they make investments that benefit business for exactly that reason. The local government all over the country has taken that responsibility seriously. It strikes me that really what you're getting at is it appropriate for government to do that in the cultural sector as well as, say, in manufacturing? And I think my answer to that would be absolutely. In fact, the cultural sector is growing in importance as manufacturing shrinks. I'm very sorry about the shrinkage of manufacturing in Chicago. But as culture grows in importance, I think it's very important for the government to recognize that.
We're down to our last minute. I know, Alison, you've been following this thing. If we can condense this into a few seconds, the Portage Theater is an interesting study in this. A church group wanted to buy the theater. Yesterday?
Wants to buy the whole building, the complex, part of which is the Portage Theater, and turn it into a church. And this has got the neighborhood, the alderman who sees the theater as the centerpiece of his economic redevelopment, making that stretch, the Six Corners, an entertainment district, and this is sort of on the model of some of the ideas that are being developed in the cultural plan. So one of the things they've done is they're trying to seek landmark historic status, historic landmark status.
That's before the Landmark Commission now, I understand, right?
And I don't know what that means in terms, what's behind that and what that means, but they certainly are trying to find.
They wouldn't be able to change the facade or whatever that might involve. I mean, it's interesting because I lived in, we got no time for this, but I lived up on the north side at the time that the Northtown changed hands and became a religious thing, and within a few years it was destroyed and gotta go. Okay. I'm sorry to say. Alison Cuddy, Nick Rabkin, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Ken.
Another one of these conversations is going to go on for hours longer, but at least we got a capsule of it. So thank you so much. Hope you come back.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
You've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV. You can see this program right here, and you can also see that little address down there. You can actually watch this program anytime by going online and seeing it. You can also download our podcast, which I hope you will do. We will see you next time right here on Chicago Newsroom on CAN TV. Thanks so much for watching. See you next week. Take it easy.